There are places in this world that seem eternal. Yellowstone is one of those places. But this land, so often described as pristine and untouched, has a story far more complicated than the postcards suggest. The birth of America's first national park was a turning point, not just for conservation, but for power. Who wielded it, who was written out of the narrative, and how the idea of nature itself is reshaped in the American imagination. Welcome to Too Complicated for History. I am Isaac S. Loftus, and as always, I am joined by my co-host, Dr. Lynn Price-Robbins.
Hey, everyone.
And we come to you twice a month to bring you the history that has fallen through the cracks of your curriculum. And today we're talking about a subject that is a little bit different than what we normally talk about, and it's something that I've only come to appreciate since moving out to California. Out here, in comparison to where I grew up outside of Philadelphia, there's a lot of open space. And a lot of preserved open space that's meant to be enjoyed as open space. A lot of them are national parks. There's a number of them that I've come to visit: Joshua Tree, Yosemite, Yellowstone, that are nearby. And today we have a very special guest to talk about the history of those national parks.
Yes, I'm super excited about this because I live in Virginia. So I'm near the Shenandoah National Park and lots of Civil War sites. So I'm love the national parks and very excited to talk more about them. We have Dr. Megan Kate Nelson here. She's a writer, a historian, and author of Saving Yellowstone: Exploration and Preservation in Reconstruction America. And she has a new course on Great Courses, which is called Stories of America's National Parks. And there are 12 episodes, I believe. And so you can learn all about different national parks and then set off on your family vacation in this over the summer. I think national parks are a great place to go. Thanks for being here with us, Megan.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So my first question for you was, what sort of brought the interest in Yellowstone? Was it personal that you had visited and you kind of fell in love with it, which I think is very easy to do? Or if you maybe came to it through another topic that, you were working on or interested in?
Mhm. Well, like you both, I have always loved national parks. And my parents, I'm going to, sort of age myself here, but in the 1970s and 80s, when I was just a young girl, my parents took us on summer vacations and we went by car. So
Mhm.
we drove all across the United States in all different directions and went to national parks. And the first of those major trips in 1982 was northward from Colorado, where I grew up. And our first stop was Yellowstone. And we stayed there. We stayed in the park at the big log inn, the Old Faithful Inn.
Yes.
And I have these hysterical photographs, which if you take the Great Courses class, you'll see. They let me use them. So there you'll see
Oh, that's great.
me and my brother in our powder jackets, which were the height of style. And my brother's like sporting this great like headband, like Karate Kid
Nice.
style. And we're posing in all the sites, right? So and I often talk about how this is sort of how I became, I think, an environmental historian, tracking it back to those experiences of moving through the landscape and really seeing the country on the ground and seeing the differences between regions and going to different cities and really having an understanding not only of natural environments but also the country's built environments. And so as an environmental historian, I've been writing about the West for a little while. And I hadn't been back to Yellowstone in a fair bit, but I was finishing the book before the Yellowstone book, The Three-Cornered War, which is a book about the Civil War in the desert Southwest. And one of the protagonists in that book is a surveyor. And so I was doing background research on him and surveying, and I ran into this Hayden survey, Ferdinand Hayden, who was a geologist, and he led the first scientific survey of Yellowstone in 1871. And this was back in like 2018.
Okay.
So I'm thinking about this and I'm thinking, oh, interesting. This was 1871. He took this trip, and then this led directly to the passage of the Yellowstone Act, which created the first national park in the world. And I was like 1872, and I thought, oh, the 150th anniversaries are coming up. And everybody loves an anniversary.
Hmm.
So
Sure.
when the minute I thought about that, I remember this moment. I was writing or editing or something in a cafe, and I had this sort of epiphany, and I fired off an email to my agent and just said, "What do you think of this? What do you think of, telling the story of this expedition and how it led to this moment, and we could publish the book for the anniversary?" And she was like, "I like it. Get started." And I'm like, "Well, I have to finish this other one first."
Kind of busy.
Kind of busy at the moment. And maybe you remember I have to turn in this other thing. Um, but we pitched it, and my editor liked it, and so I started on that book a week before the pandemic began and before the
Oh,
shutdown began. So,
Wow, I don't know if that was good or bad. You had
yeah,
more time, I imagine?
it was. Yeah, I mean, I wrote that book pretty much from my own house. A book about
Nice.
exploration and nature and and travel. In some ways, it was really nice to kind of immerse myself in the West. I live in Boston now, and so
okay.
Oh,
there aren't big, majestic mountains or any hot springs or geysers that I know about there. So it was kind of nice to be able to escape in that way. So I would say it was it was half personal, half professional, which I think is what most good history work is, really.
absolutely. Yep. Got to
Yeah,
have
That's
that
really cool.
passion. I
yeah,
think.
Before we dive into
totally.
more of the history, I'm very jealous of those because I grew up in the suburbs and we didn't do those like road
Hmm.
like those Americana
Hmm.
road trips and when you say like great mountains and things like that, I think for people who haven't left the East Coast, it is big over here. Like it is shockingly large. I don't think you have a sense of scale or scope of like what it's like to stand next to the Rockies or like see
Hmm.
them until you see them in person.
Yeah.
It's just a different level of grandeur. Um,
Yeah.
that you have to go see in person. So I would recommend go travel on the ground so you can see that
Yes.
stuff from a
Yes.
standing
Totally.
perspective. But
Absolutely. Someone was talking to me about going to Yellowstone, trying to figure out whether to go to Yellowstone and Grand Teton,
Hmm.
and whether to go then to Glacier or whether they should go to Utah, to all the
mhm,
Utah parks. And I was like, I don't think you can do all of that. It would take you probably 3 weeks to do
Yeah.
yeah,
all of that really well, right? Not only because those parks are huge in and of themselves,
Mhm.
but they're so far away from each other.
right.
Right.
It takes
Yeah.
Yeah,
6 hours. It takes like 6 to 8 hours to drive from one to the other. Like
Right.
and
You
you're not
feel
going to
like they're
enjoy that.
close. It's like, oh, yeah, they're
yeah. There's a lot of
close, but
space
not so
Yes.
between
much.
things.
Yeah. So exactly what you're saying, Isaac. This is the thing that I think is distinctive. There are many things distinctive about the American West in relation to other regions, but one of those things is these huge distances between places.
Yeah, for
Um,
sure.
yeah, and you have to
Now,
go.
just to set the
Yes.
stage, and I don't want to open up a whole can of worms, so I'm going to put a very difficult historian challenge. In a few sentences, can you describe
Oh my gosh.
Reconstruction?
Oh my
Reconstruction
goodness.
era. Just enough to understand, the environment, because you're saying this first survey took in 1871. So,
Right.
Yes.
what is America at that moment? What?
Sure. Yeah. So US textbooks usually define Reconstruction as extending from 1865 to 1877, right? Like the end of the Civil War from Appomattox to the election of Rutherford B. Hayes, and the withdrawal of US troops from the southern states.
Mhm.
And that time period generally kind of defines Reconstruction as a uniquely Southern experience. That
Hmm.
this is a lot of policy action, a lot of legislation happening in the wake of the American Civil War, where the United States wins. They want to bring the Confederacy back into the Union, the former Confederate states, but to do that, those states have to pass the 13th, the 14th, and then the 15th Amendments,
Mhm.
which outlaw slavery and provide for full citizenship and voting rights for Black men in the United States. And they have to promise basically to defend Black civil rights during this period. And that is a very Southern focused way of thinking about Reconstruction, which, I can totally see. This is one of the major movements happening here in this post Civil War era. But what people often forget is that both Northerners and Southerners were also thinking about the West during this period.
Mhm.
So, and when you think about expanding that geography, it sort of expands the time period also. I mean, there have been debates about, did Reconstruction start during the Civil War itself? Has it ever really ended? You know,
Right.
Yeah, that's fair.
and that's already been more than your 2 to 3 sentences, Isaac. I'm sorry, but as you know, complicated.
Yes.
It's just to
Yes.
go. Yes, but if you would like to edit for the short answer, historians usually agree that the Reconstruction period is this period of about 15 to 20 years after the Civil War, when the country's trying to come back together. And the
Okay.
United States is trying to bring the former Confederate states back into the Union. They're trying to integrate the Western states and territories into the Union. And they're
Right.
trying to deal with two populations, Black Americans, 4 million of them newly freed, formerly enslaved people, and then Indigenous peoples across the West who
Right.
are resisting federal government efforts to corral them and take their land.
So, what does that have to do with Yellowstone? Because would be my
Well,
next question.
yes. So, well, good, because this was, in fact, one of my questions going into the
Sure.
book, because I thought one of the things that I thought after I was like, oh, this could be a good book idea was, well, then what am I going to say that's different from what any other environmental historian has said about this survey or the Yellowstone Act and the history of conservation in America? And then I thought, well, you know what? The Three Cornered War, my previous book, was sort of saying what happens when we think about the Civil War from an unexpected place, the desert Southwest. Well, what if we think about Reconstruction from an unexpected place, which is Yellowstone?
Yeah.
So, why would the U.S. Congress, when they're in the middle of just this mess, right? The economy is in chaos. They're trying to deal with the rise of the KKK in the South. Why would they then not only fund Ferdinand Hayden's scientific expedition to the tune of $40,000, where that's a lot of money
Yeah.
at that time, and then why would they devote time to doing this really unprecedented thing, which is taking land from territories and giving them to the Department of the Interior to manage?
Right.
Why would they even do that? And in the course of my research, I discovered that it was because, the U.S. federal government had always been interested in bringing the West into the Union. They had always been interested in controlling the states and the territories of the West and sort of using that space to build the future of the nation. And they were also very interested in this moment in discovering kind of new American places that might bring Northerners and Southerners back together, and possibly Westerners too.
Right.
And at this moment in time, now Yellowstone had not been mapped. They only had kind of vague rumors of what was going on in there. There had been a couple civilian explorations. There were some rumors from trappers and scouts, but there had been no official federal survey. So they wanted to know what was there. And Ferdinand Hayden at least suspected what was there. And he knew that if he went into this place and he found what he thought he was going to find, that this was going to be one of the most unique places in the world, right? And that's a really big deal when you have a country in crisis. If there's something that you can feel good about in the nation, that can be very helpful in kind of bringing people together or making them feel like they are part of one body politic again, kind of culturally or ideologically.
And I like in your book how the people who did go to Yellowstone come back and they describe it, and everyone's like, they're crazy. It can't look like that. And I've been there, it does. But they're like, they're crazy. They're exaggerating, and then when they actually get there, it's like, oh my gosh. Because,
Right.
you
Yeah.
got to think, no cameras.
Like
No,
mud exploding out of the ground. Like, are
right.
you
It's like, it's
serious?
crazy. And that there it is.
Like, yeah, a cliff made of glass.
Like,
What?
what?
Like, it's like,
Come on.
Yeah.
no.
And then you go
Yeah.
and, it's there.
It sounded too crazy to be believed.
So definitely in regards to, like this federal power, when I first moved to Virginia and I started going to Shenandoah National
Hmm.
Park and the other national parks, I would see these random chimneys, stone chimneys, and nothing else. Like why are there chimneys out here? And as I eventually started to learn more and more, I realized that people that had been sort of kicked off their homesteads, like removed from their families' homes that had been there for generations to make this national park. And that
Hmm.
was something that I never thought about. It's not
Hmm.
like this was all empty land. Same kind of thing we talk about the natives. This wasn't all empty land that they said, let's make it a national park. They had to remove people to
Right.
make that national park. And I mean, I know that's in the East, but you've got this taking place, and then you've got this federal versus state power that starts before the Civil War.
Hmm.
Civil War, it's all about that. And then we get to Reconstruction and we're still fighting. So how does this, federal versus state play out when we get to the national parks in Yellowstone?
Oh yeah, this is a major issue. And people are always shocked when I talk about Yellowstone with public audiences. They're always really shocked to know that in the debate over the Yellowstone Act, there were two objections. And they were coming from mostly Southern Democrats, but also who were kind of small government people, but
Hmm.
also Western Republicans and Democrats. And the two objections were federal overreach.
Okay.
Sounds familiar.
Yes.
Right? This is very, very much still with us.
Hmm.
Yeah, the idea that the federal government could just take land from Wyoming, Idaho, and Montana
Hmm.
Mm.
and just absorb it into the federal government and the federal government would manage it. That was just, it was unprecedented. It was a crazy idea. I mean,
Right.
Right.
most Americans, really believed in the idea that public land should be, free for the taking or at least free for purchase and
Right.
settlement, right? So that was one objection. The other objection was that this would violate white settler land rights.
Hmm.
Hmm.
And because that kind of idea that they should be able to go wherever they want, take up land wherever they want, develop it as farmers or ranchers or miners, or businessmen in some other sort of context, that was not only the center of manifest destiny, which is
Right.
one of the strongest narratives in American culture, but also the center of the American dream. I mean,
Right.
so you have this like
That's a good point.
dovetailing
Yeah.
where people are like, well, if we take this huge amount of land out of Wyoming and no one can settle it or develop it, what does that actually mean? And what kind of federal power is that? That means they can take anything they want, right?
Sure.
They can
Right.
take private property. Of course, they didn't really care about indigenous land rights. They were like,
Right.
Exactly.
whatever. Like,
Yeah.
we'll extinguish their title if they have one.
Mhm.
And they discovered that Yellowstone actually was not in any sort of treaty at the time.
Yeah, I was going
Was
to
not covered.
ask. Yeah,
Yeah,
was there any tension there? Because in
no.
the East, in the 18th century, there was lots of treaties that was, and they were undermined in various ways. But at least the
Hmm.
federal, not directly by the federal government at first. So I was curious if that was like, oh, this is the federal government trying to underhandedly get rid of a treaty that, or you know ignore a treaty that they previously signed. But it's just not, just wasn't part of anything.
What's interesting about Yellowstone is that it was used by actually 27 tribal nations. Um,
Interesting.
yeah, a lot,
Wow.
who are still affiliated with Yellowstone today.
Hmm.
And they used it as a thoroughfare to get from the sort of northwestern part of Yellowstone down into the Great Plains to hunt
Hmm.
bison. They used it as hunting ground itself because a lot of animals are attracted to that area because the soil is so warm, and especially in the winter. And so they would often go hunting there. They used it to collect obsidian from Obsidian Cliff,
Hmm.
and also to collect all kinds of plants for medicinal purposes. And they went for ceremonial purposes also. And there were a couple of scattered bands, including one Shoshone band, who did live in the mountains of western Yellowstone. But the U.S. had no treaty with them, and so because it was this sort of amazing collective space,
Hmm.
because it wasn't claimed by just one tribal nation, there was no treaty covering
Hmm.
it. One part of it
Right.
had been included in a Crow treaty, the Upsalaki, in the early 1850s, but then that treaty got wiped out with the Treaty of Fort Laramie, and their
Hmm.
reservation was uh, kind of made smaller, as most were during that period. And so it was taken out. So they didn't have to do anything with any
Hmm.
treaty at all when they
Hmm.
were considering passing this act. But it was going to take land away from territories, which
Right.
many Americans did not think was right.
So even though there wasn't any like sort of legal hurdle for them to jump over,
Hmm.
how, was there? How did the native nations that did use the space react to this particular proposal or this
Hmm.
idea that it might be? Obviously, they were already it was already part of territories in some form or fashion, so there was some interaction with uh, governmental structures or colonial governmental structures at some level. But this is a step further than that.
Right.
Hmm.
Yeah. Conflict with indigenous polities that lived kind of outside the borders of the park after it was created in 1872, those conflicts didn't really happen until a little bit later, until the
Okay.
Hmm.
1870s and 1880s. But at the time, the Lakota, particularly the Hunkpapa Lakota under Sitting Bull, uh, they did not live in Yellowstone proper, but they did claim much of the Yellowstone River Valley as their
Okay.
territory for them and their allies. And they were concerned, they had not seen Ferdinand Hayden's survey because Hayden came in a different direction. They did not go through Lakota territory. They came up from Ogden, Utah on the western side of the park and came in from the north instead of coming up the Missouri River and crossing through Lakota country.
Hmm.
But there were lots of signs to the Lakota that Americans were encroaching. And one of the most important ones to them was the Northern Pacific Railroad. And there were
Hmm.
surveyors
Hmm.
for that particular venture in their territory by the early 1870s. And Sitting Bull began to attack them in multiple engagements and push them back, and actually managed to scuttle the whole Northern Pacific Railroad project for about 10 years.
Hmm.
And what was interesting about that moment and about particularly the Lakota action during this period is that it leads directly to the Battle of Little Bighorn.
Oh, really?
So, oh yeah, which was 1876. So in this period, all of the tribal nations that live kind of in this area, particularly on the eastern and sort of northeastern side of Yellowstone, including the Northern Cheyenne and the Northern Arapaho, allied with the Lakota and began to sort of work together. And those are the groups that were at the Battle of the Rosebud and the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876. And so this is part of a larger engagement,
Hmm.
and there are kind of white surveyors, federal employees, migrants, miners, kind of all on the move in this territory during this period. And that just creates a lot of conflict with several different tribal nations, but the Lakota in particular.
It's fascinating how sort of the government went about taking over, I'll say, this area. And you talk about this concept of settler colonialism and sort of how to sort of promote the West to almost send people out to then colonize it so it can become a part of the United States. So can you talk a little bit about that? And I mean, including the railroads, because the railroads are
Hmm.
huge at this time.
Oh,
Like this is, all of a sudden we're traveling at what they would say is lightning speed.
oh
You
30
know,
some miles an hour.
yeah,
yeah, 30 some
exactly.
miles an hour. It's like,
Exactly.
you're going through time. It's so, and I think the railroads are when we start uh, with the time and the time, what is it, the time zones. I think that's sort
Yes,
of a train thing as well.
it is.
So I mean, a lot is changing
Oh,
right now in the US and the West, and it all kind of starts with this idea of settler colonialism.
it does. And this is a term that, was not in use during the time,
Right.
but historians have sort of started to use it as a framework to really explain how and why white American settlers took lands from Indigenous peoples across
Mhm.
the West and really across the nation as well. I think we can see settler colonialism happening from the 17th century onward, right?
Right.
Oh yeah.
In North America. And so um, it's the idea that you take lands away from Native peoples either through acts of violence and extermination or outright removal. Yes. And then you give white settlers the opportunity and the means to turn that land into farms, into ranches, into towns. And by kind of staying put and sitting there, they are then actively colonizing this place. Um,
Right.
and of course, what it makes it sound like the settlers are doing this all on their own or all of their own volition. It's and that kind of idea is part of the pioneer myth that like here are all
Mhm.
these, white families striking out on their own and they're all
Yeah.
individualists and they're all, winning the West by themselves.
Mhm.
When in reality, the federal government is helping them every step of the way,
Mm.
right? I mean,
Right.
they are um, they're building forts across the West and
Mhm.
garrisoning them with soldiers who protect migrants and protect these white settlers as they move through the West and as they try to build towns. Across these vast distances, like we were talking about earlier.
Mhm.
They also passed the Homestead Act during the Civil War itself. People often forget this too. The Homestead Act and the Pacific Railway Act were passed in 1862, like right in the middle of the
Mhm.
Civil War. It's like,
Yep.
why? Why would the US Congress, in the middle of 62, which is, one of the worst years of the Civil War, like,
Mhm.
why are they passing these laws? And the answer to that is that they had been trying to pass those laws since the early 1850s, but Southerners had
Right.
never let them because there was so much sectional rancor and
Mhm.
they could never agree on the railroad route or
Mhm.
how people should settle and whether or not they would be allowed to have slavery. Um, so they took advantage of the war itself and their huge majority now in Congress and passed these two very important pieces of legislation. And so now white settlers ultimately would have a very fast means of getting to all of these, vast tracts of land.
Right.
They would be protected by U.S. Army soldiers who also were given the funding and the resources to launch campaigns against Native peoples
Mm.
Mm.
to either kill them outright or force them to surrender and push them onto reservations. And then they're giving them means of transport to get to these places.
Right.
And so that this is why because I'm from the West, so I'm very familiar with that argument that the West is all like states' rights and they don't like federal interference. And I'm like, you are built on federal interference.
That's why you
Like,
exist.
Right.
this is what created the West.
Yeah, I was going to ask, is that a framework of settler colonialism in contrast to another way to understand that kind of like the idea that you're going to just sort of like plop yourself down and sort of put down roots and calcify in that, and then therefore
Hmm.
have it absorbed into the nation, like to the the Anglo nation.
Right.
Is that in is it in contrast to an older way of a framework of thinking about this, or is it or the pioneer myth that you're talking about? I'm just out of
Yeah, definitely. I mean,
okay,
it definitely is meant to supplant the pioneer myth and also to call attention to the fact that white settlement and westward expansion depends on Indian removal,
right,
right?
okay,
And
Mhm.
that makes
extermination,
sense.
right?
Yeah, yeah,
Like
yeah.
Right.
that is part of the process, and
Mhm.
Indigenous peoples are often erased from that whole story, right?
Sure.
Right.
So you don't consider their land loss, you don't consider their cultural loss or their,
Mhm.
their sovereignty as a people, and you don't consider their trauma of being attacked and forced to go live in another place where they have no experience with that
Right.
Mhm.
particular natural environment. So yeah,
Yeah.
that's what it was meant to do.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Right. And we've done a few other episodes. The West likes to come up in our podcast,
It forces
and
itself into your
and
conversation.
Yeah.
it's so interesting. And one of the things you talk about in your book that is sort of things that we've thought of because of our West podcasts are this, I mean, I'll use the word propaganda, but it's sort of like the visual culture, the literary culture, like this creation of the West that isn't in reality the reality on the ground, but the West that becomes the one of, Teddy Roosevelt
Hmm.
and, the people who want to go out there, the cowboy. Um, how did that play a role? I mean, to me, it's propaganda,
Yeah,
but,
it's interesting that you brought up that idea of like, hey, here's a thing that can bring us together.
Hmm.
yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
almost.
Yeah,
Hmm.
exactly. I mean, the West was always had been a sort of region of fascination
Hmm.
in travel literature, in, the survey reports going back to Lewis and Clark, right? And people were really interested. They had no idea what was out there. I think it's hard for us to access that now because the images are just everywhere. Even if
Right.
you haven't been to
Right.
Yellowstone, you know what's there, right?
It's true.
Um, and so the only thing that really replicates it now would be like something like Mars, or if
Sure.
we manage to land some sort of rover on Venus. Like, what is
Yeah.
even there? We have no idea what it
Yeah.
even looks like, right? So, in the early 19th century, that was the same for a lot of Americans living on the East Coast, and they had no idea what was out there. They wanted to see it, and so
Hmm.
surveyors took illustrators with them.
Hmm.
And part of the reason for that too is that, sort of like all these stories about Yellowstone, they wanted people to believe them, right? And
Hmm.
if they had, because,
Because
you
it does seem
know,
real.
they could say anything, right? They could be
Right.
like, "Oh yeah, we went to the Rockies and there was a city of gold," like, and everyone would be like, "What? Well, what did it look like?" And then they get caught in a lie. But so they wanted illustrators with them to depict the landscape so that they could actually show what was there. And then they also had cartographers. So
Hmm.
mapping was super important during this period, even though sometimes it was just incredibly wrong.
Hmm.
But there were ways of visualizing the West, right? And I don't know if you guys have read or know about Elliot West's new book um, about the West. It's a monster book. It's like 700 pages long. A history of
Hmm.
the American West, and he talks about in that book the great coincidence, the fact that like gold was found in the Sierras at the
Hmm.
same time that the U.S. had, gotten all these grand designs and decided to fight
Mm.
Mexico and get this Mexican land cession,
Right.
right? And
Gotcha.
this happens all in the like almost all at the same moment, which is
Hmm.
nuts. Um, but the great coincidence, or for Yellowstone, is that in the same moment when people are becoming really interested and curious about the West, and these white settlers are kind of moving in after in the wake of the Civil War, photography becomes a technology that
Yeah.
is widespread and mobile.
Right.
And, that happened during the Civil War.
Hmm.
So, Ferdinand Hayden, when he went on his expedition, he took with him a painter, Thomas Moran. He also took an illustrator and several map makers, and then also the photographer, William Henry Jackson.
Hmm.
And these visual images were so important. I mean, of course, it was black and white photography. And so you needed Thomas Moran's watercolors and his later oil paintings to give you a sense of the colors of Yellowstone, which are, you know, like
Otherworldly.
crazy.
Like, yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're so wild. And and again, no one would have believed it, right? But
Right.
Thomas Moran had his watercolors with him, and so he was like painting in the field in these amazing colors and noting what the colors were so that he could go back to his studio in New Jersey and like paint
Hmm.
Hmm.
um, these huge, massive, epic canvases of Yellowstone. But it was the photography that was, I think, the most important, because in that period, even though like photographers from the very beginning could manipulate images,
Hmm.
and we're so used to that now, right? Like,
Oh yeah.
Right.
You're like, is this really real? No.
no. And, I mean, even now I'm like, is there an image? I could probably count on one hand an image that I have not manipulated, right? And posted to
Hmm.
social media or something. Like, is there
Yep.
something I've actually put out there that I have not like messed with, that I haven't cropped, that I haven't adjusted in some
Yeah.
way?
There's an early
Yep.
photographer, not to go on a tangent, but I forget who it is, but there's a wonderful quote about burning and dodging, which is a photo manipulation technique that it
Hmm.
persists in
Oh,
Photoshop, but it's about lightening and darkening. call it like a space. That's what burning and dodging. So like you burn it, it gets darker. You dodge and it gets lighter.
Nice.
Um, and that was an early technique that you can do with
Hmm.
photochemical pictures. They were doing that way
Hmm.
early in the late 1800s.
Early
But
Photoshop,
yeah,
right?
but a photographer described it as correcting mistakes that God made. Like, that's
How
what
very
that
fitting
is.
for today.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, and that, during that time though, even though people could do that, they believed that photographs were truth,
Hmm.
that they
Right.
depicted what was really there, right? So
Right.
Ferdinand Hayden was like, no one is going to believe us if we do not have this proof. But if we have written descriptions from 50 people, on this
Right.
on this expedition, if we have Moran's stuff, we have maps, and we have William Henry Jackson's photographs,
Hmm.
this will convince people that these natural features are real,
Mm,
and that we went there. And
Hmm.
this was also something important. It's also important to remember that the quote unquote explorers during this period were all federal employees, right?
right.
Hmm.
And they were federal contractors. Like every year they had to pitch Congress and say, I want to go here. Please give me the money. And then when they came back, they had to submit their receipts. They had to submit all of their notes and their contracts.
Prove
And
they went.
oh, yeah.
Oh,
And then they had
jeez.
to write reports.
Oh.
And if you've
Yeah.
ever gotten a federal grant, you know that you do still have to write a report
Hmm.
at the end
Yeah.
to say, I didn't just take your money and go spend it.
I did the work, I promise.
I, I actually did go on this research trip and I did it. And so the photographs were also proof that they had done what they said they were going to do also.
Gotcha.
But they were amazing. They're amazing photographs. I mean, my favorite photograph actually is the one because Jackson and Moran bunked together. They became
Okay.
pretty good friends. And Jackson would send Moran out to just be because, the painters and photographers like to have a sense of scale in their images too.
Sure.
So if you have something really big, you want to like human figure next to it so that someone
Right.
can be like, oh, okay, that's really big. And he sent Thomas Moran out onto what they called the White Mountain, which we call Mammoth Hot Springs. And there is a photograph of Moran just standing on the structure out in the middle of it. I think it's Jupiter's Terrace. I think it's the one up kind of near the top on the south end of Mammoth. And I'm just like, oh my God. Like, how close did we come to losing one of the best American landscape painters like in our history? Like,
Go
That's so
stand there.
funny.
just go
Go
stand
take a
there.
swim.
If you fall into that boiling water, nothing will happen. It'll be fine.
It's
Like, I mean,
fine.
just completely insane. They were rappelling down the side of
Wow.
the Yellowstone Canyon to take photographs of the lower falls from the river's edge. I mean,
Wow.
they were doing insane things.
Right.
But William Henry Jackson produced, over 200 images of Yellowstone. And his images and Thomas Moran's watercolors, along with a lot of the specimens that they picked up,
Mhm.
especially some of the more exotic ones, and of course, they also broke off pieces of mammoth and
Of
just
course.
took samples from everywhere. They Ferdinand Hayden, in order to convince some congressmen to pass the Yellowstone Act, actually created an exhibit in Congress, in the Capitol, with Jackson's photographs, some of the watercolors, some specimens, a nice illustration from Henry
Wow.
Elliott, who was their illustrator, and a map. And so they
Mhm.
created this little like Yellowstone museum
Oh my
in the middle
gosh.
of the rotunda
Huh.
to try and convince politicians to pass the Yellowstone Act, which of course they ultimately did. But so this is the way that people are kind of understanding what's there and
Mhm.
Right.
understanding that it's real. And they knew, Ferdinand Hayden, when he first stepped in and he saw all of these, he saw Mammoth Hot Springs and when he saw the geyser basins. I
Mhm.
mean, Yellowstone Falls, the two falls are beautiful and the canyon is beautiful, but like the geothermal region
Mhm. Oh
is
yeah.
unique in all the world.
Mhm.
Right.
And I don't think anyone had sort of realized that. They knew that there were geysers in New Zealand. They knew there were some in Iceland. Geologists
Mhm.
had been writing about this. But And it's true. I actually went on a vacation, it was before the pandemic, so like 2019, I think, to Chile.
Hmm.
And in the Atacama Desert, they have a like Yellowstone type area, like a
Hmm.
hot springs type area. And so we go, and I'm all excited, and our guide like says, "Okay, here's the walkway. I'll like meet you on the other side." And I was like, I mean, it literally was about 400 meters, and we walked down this walkway, and they're like little boiling springs, and like some geyser action, and then it ends, and I'm like, "Is this it? Is this the park?" And it's like, and I felt kind of bad, but they were like, "Yeah, yeah, because Yellowstone is larger than every other geothermal feature in the world
Right.
combined." I mean, it's just like
It's not a fair comparison.
it's not a fair comparison.
That's
Yeah.
a very similar experience to people who have been to Times Square in New York and then wanted to come to Hollywood Boulevard here in LA. Right? They come here and they're like, "This is it." I'm like, "Yep, this is it.
Like,
It's just this 2 blocks."
It's like, well, this is disappointing.
Yeah.
Yep.
Sorry about that. Not quite the same urban
No.
space in
But
Los Angeles.
but that's
Yeah.
that's so what is actually in the Yellowstone Act? Like what does it actually
Mhm.
purport to do?
Yeah.
Excellent question. So the text of the act kind of marked the boundaries of the park, and they're pretty close actually to what they are now. There have been a little additions on the edges,
Mhm.
but the um, the amount of land that they actually kind of marked out in the first part of the act is pretty much what we have now. And then it declared that these lands would now be under the supervision of the Department of the Interior, and that they would manage them, and that Congress was empowered to kind of give money, at their discretion to support the park, and that this land would be for the benefit of the people, and it could
Mm.
not be developed, and you couldn't build anything on it unless you had a federal license to do so. You could not hunt there unless you had a federal license to do so, or if you were trying to feed yourself. That was kind of one of the,
Okay.
if you
Yeah.
were a hunter, if like you
Right.
were a sport hunter and you were on a tour in the park, like you were
Mhm.
allowed to like shoot a rabbit and eat it. But
Right, right.
otherwise, you were not allowed to go like big game hunting for elk.
Right.
You weren't going to go to jail for being hungry and then catching a
Correct.
squirrel.
Yes.
Uh,
Right. Right.
Although, because this became a federal space, and an environmental historian whose name I can't believe I'm blanking on his name, wrote this amazing book about national parks and how they demonize indigenous people as
Mhm.
poachers,
Hmm.
people who are trying to use the land as they have always used it, and
Right.
they are
Right.
then redefined because of park boundaries as trespassers.
Gotcha.
Carl Jacobi, that's what it is. A book called Crimes of Nature. And and this is what happens when it becomes a federal space, right?
Right.
Then it becomes a place where if you're on it without permission or you haven't paid the entry fee, you are a trespasser.
That's
Right.
true.
Yeah. So it just kind of laid it out. It's a pretty simple bill, unlike today's bills that are like a gazillion pages long. I think it's only
Hmm.
like a couple of paragraphs,
Okay.
which is interesting. And it had a provision saying that there would be a superintendent, and that
Hmm.
superintendent, would be paid, not very much. But you know, uh, this was the very first national park because Yosemite had been saved, but it was the opposite. Congress in 1864 had taken the land from California. They had sort of taken this land of Yosemite and gave it to the state of California to manage
Gotcha.
instead of the federal government. So it was sort of,
Right.
and then they converted that in 1890, and Yosemite became a national park. But yeah, this was the first kind of unprecedented act, not only of federal land taking, but of the creation of a park like this, where its sole purpose was to save it for the people.
Hmm.
Yeah, that's so that give me, I still, even though you're saying that's the reason, why? Was the argument like I
That's
understand
not enough for
I
me,
understand the
Yeah.
yeah,
Patrick
but
says.
even that like I don't like so yes, there's I understand that
Mhm.
from a modern perspective and obviously all the benefits that
Right.
it's had over the years, but at the time why did that
Yeah.
argument win out over but we should be able to settle like all of those other reasons that we've talked about.
Hmm.
Right. Well, one of the reasons goes back to, and I'm sure you guys have talked about this, the old fight between Jefferson and the French scientist about whether America was, had superior or its own animals and things like that. Like it had a unique kind of
Yeah,
landscape and a unique nature.
Yes.
actually
Because the
very
United.
recently talked about that.
Oh, good. Okay.
New book.
Yeah,
Yes.
Oh,
yeah,
excellent. Okay.
We'll link to the podcast,
Oh,
everyone, in the show notes.
fantastic. But yeah, so these fights have been going on since the founding of the country to sort of
Mhm.
say, because whenever I think a country founds itself, it has to create its own kind of myths and its own kind of
Hmm.
identity. And one of those identities was in the incredible kind of landscape features of the United
Mhm.
States.
Hmm.
During that period, one of those was the Natural Bridge of Virginia, and then, of course, Niagara Falls.
Oh, yes.
And many people had been really shocked at how kind of cheap and tawdry Niagara Falls had become, because
If
it
only
was
they
it
knew.
was not preserved at that time. And so there were
Oh, okay.
people, all these like, little hawkers and shopkeepers had built all of this like crappy stuff all around the falls.
Yeah.
And you felt like you couldn't really enjoy it. Like this is what a lot
Hmm.
of tourists were saying in the 1830s and 40s when they started to go there in larger numbers because of the Erie
Sure.
Canal.
Hmm.
Um, made it more possible for tourism to happen. So those are two things, right? Like one, the United States becomes invested in natural landscapes to prove that even though they're a new country, they have old geology and they have
Right.
Sure.
old, beautiful, spectacular, sublime landscapes. And this kind of the phrase, and I can't remember if they use this phrase or if this is one that I just learned kind of in art history, but it was sort of termed nature's nation.
Okay.
Okay.
Like the United States, again, may not have 500 years of history
Hmm.
like England or Italy, but what it does have is Niagara Falls, and what it does
Hmm.
have is the Mammoth Cave of Kentucky, and what it does have are like these beautiful views from the top of the Shenandoah. Like
Yeah.
it has these things which Europe does not have, right?
Right.
And so that makes it unique and it makes it exceptional. And so part of Ferdinand Hayden wrote also a report for the committee. I think the Committee on Public Lands and the Committee of the Territories, attesting to the uniqueness of the geothermal field and
Mhm.
Hmm.
saying, this area is incredible. It is huge. There's nowhere like it in the world. It will be a laboratory for scientists. People will want to come and see it. It is extraordinary, and that was really convincing
Mm.
to a lot of Republicans who, of course, at this time were the kind of big federal government guys who
Hmm.
believed in passing legislation to like for the betterment of the people, right? Because that's in many ways what the 14th and the 15th Amendment were also about.
Hmm.
Mhm.
The
So
betterment of, yeah.
is this sort of the beginning of this idea of American exceptionalism? That sort of you see throughout history. Was it, prior, or was this sort of a new thing where it's like, here's why we're, an exceptional nation in the world?
I think that goes back to the 18th century. I think
Hmm.
I think actually the colonists had to have a sense of themselves as pretty exceptional,
That's true.
right? In order to band
Can't argue
together.
with that.
Yeah, and to say, "Hey, you know what? Like we're unique people. We're going to
Especially after
Hmm.
we
throw
win the
off."
war, I guess. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we don't lose and get strung up. Then we're not
Yeah.
very unique. Then we're just, dead.
Right.
Just not good. So I think those ideas had been around for a while, but I
Mhm.
Hmm.
think it's in this moment when that idea becomes absorbed in the natural features of the United States, and
Right.
that
Okay.
a national park, I mean, everyone says like, yes, this is America's best idea, right?
Hmm.
This
Right.
is, and they are national parks, as they are in the United States, are still kind of unique in all the world. I mean, there
Hmm.
are parks in other countries. There are, of course, like urban parks and other kind of saved, preserved places. And there are game parks and reserves and places like that across the world. But the kind of extensive program that we have under the National Park Service and the Department of the Interior, the U.S. Forest Service, creating national forests. I mean, and Lynn, as you were noting too, like the, battlefield parks and historic
Mm-hmm.
sites, and a park like Mesa Verde, which is the first one to be saved for cultural reasons, right?
Mm.
Mm.
That the indigenous past is now considered something valuable in American history.
Yeah.
That's unusual in 1904. And so I think that American exceptionalism becomes part of that conversation becomes about these amazing natural wonders that
Right.
we have, and that we need to save them in order to save a sense of ourselves as a nation.
And
So,
without passing judgment on using these things or telling that story, I do think that that is an interesting thing that they were focused on doing during Reconstruction at a moment when, a sense of self
Hmm.
was necessary to rebuild.
and
Um,
that's what I was thinking, because that was it's a nice idea, and to think of all these wonderful things, but then you go back east and you're like, wait a minute, it's Reconstruction, Civil War. Now we're supposed, oh, we're racially equal, and then how is this playing out in the West? Because living in the East, that's what Reconstruction is to us. Is
Hmm.
this, how do we get more racially equal now? Slavery has ended. Now what? How do we come
Yeah.
together as a people? Now, when you say, we become a people in the West, is that just the white settlers? Are we including others?
Yeah. I mean,
Or, who's included in that
right.
definition?
yeah, benefit of the people.
Definitely not indigenous people. Like,
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
yeah,
Yeah.
definitely not Chinese immigrants who are already during this period also undergoing acts
Mm-hmm.
of expulsion and immigration restriction. Um, it does become a kind of white vision, and I think there was a sense that kind of a pride in Yellowstone, or sort of thinking about this space as an inherently American space,
Mm-hmm.
meant that it was something to be proud of for white Northerners and Southerners, so that they could come
Okay.
back together as sort of part of their national reunion.
Right.
Um, and there is an interesting body of work and increasing conversation about national park sites, about nature, and how they are kind of coded and experienced as white spaces.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Mm-hmm.
and organizations now that take in not only indigenous but also Asian and Black Americans into national parks, and they go hiking, and they so that there is a presence there,
Right.
that these are their parks too, right? And of
Mm-hmm.
course national parks are indigenous land, right?
Right.
They
Absolutely.
they are.
Yeah.
And it has only really been recently that the National Park Service has taken that seriously and has
Mm-hmm.
Mhm.
brought tribal leaders in to be kind of equal stakeholders, although that equality is probably not achievable kind of in the current frame, the way the National Park Service is run.
Mm-hmm.
um, but I do know that for Yellowstone's 150th, there was a concerted effort to bring the 27 tribal nations who have affiliations with Yellowstone into the conversations and the planning for
Hmm.
those celebrations.
Oh, wow. That's
Yeah,
great.
and they now have a Native American history kind of dedicated building at Old
Nice.
Faithful, which is hugely important because Old Faithful is the most visited site, right? Like if you're
Mm-hmm.
gonna if
Yep.
you're gonna go to Yellowstone and you only hit one, it's probably going to be it's probably going to be Old
Old
Faithful.
Faithful.
Yeah.
And so to have indigenous people represented there, and their perceptions of nature and their approach and their histories in this region, is hugely important.
Mm.
But it's still not, I mean, if you go to any park, I mean,
Mm-hmm.
like Lynn, as you were saying, when you go to Shenandoah, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, you just see the remnants of those families, right? And
Right.
there are probably no markers that
Nope.
tell you anything about the removal of those people. They certainly don't tell you anything about the way that those people removed Native people or forced them across the Shenandoah into the valley and beyond.
Yes.
And they also don't often tell the story that Shenandoah was segregated initially,
Mm-hmm.
and that Black Park users could only go to certain parts of the park initially, and that didn't change until after World War II.
Just crazy.
So,
Yeah.
we have a lot of work to do to actually integrate that kind of history into the park
Mm-hmm.
experience. I mean,
Right.
like Isaac, if you go to any of California's parks, like, all of those parks are an indigenous land,
Right.
right? And California has been fairly good in other ways about recognizing that indigenous history. But I mean, if you go to Death Valley or you go to Joshua Tree, how are you going to know the history of that space? How are you going to
Right.
know,
Yeah.
how indigenous peoples used the plants of that place, or like how they managed the lack of water, or kind of what they
Mm-hmm.
kind of did in these spaces, if there are no markers, if there's nothing to
Nothing
show
to
that to you as a visitor.
Right.
right. Yeah, and I think that it's important to remember what the phrasing that you used in terms of uh, you said there's no markers for those families, like the Native families that got removed, because
Mm.
it's not a bunch of what's the military term? Combat aged men,
Mm-hmm.
like
Yeah.
right. That is it's the people you don't have to feel bad about.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But this is it is always a good idea to remember that it was families,
Mm-hmm.
elderly children
Mm-hmm.
that were uprooted. Um, but that's an important thing to remember, and it's in a place like Shenandoah. At least you have the name that has
True.
some linkage to this, but a place like Death Valley doesn't
Yeah.
evoke any sort of curiosity to being like, I wonder where that comes from.
Oh.
It's super hot.
Yeah.
That
You're
kind of
like,
makes
well,
sense.
people died.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that's the name that white settlers gave to it, right?
Right.
Like
Sure.
the indigenous people who live there and who actually do. Death Valley is interesting because there is actually a very small reservation within Death Valley.
Really?
Yeah. And the the people who live there and their ancestors didn't think of the valley as death, right?
No.
It brought
They
Yeah.
them
live there.
life.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So yeah, the renaming projects that are going on right now with a lot of natural features across the United States, I think
Mhm.
are really valuable and really important in acknowledging kind
Mhm.
of not only whose land this was and continues to be, but also kind of naming as a whole project, right?
Yeah.
And renaming as a whole project that is part of settler colonialism as
I,
well.
also, I find them incredibly valuable, even just from that, just sparking curiosity, right?
Yes.
So just
Yeah.
even being like, hey, this is not just named after some president like
Yeah.
McKinley was, like Mount McKinley was, and so like that, naming
Right.
it Denali gives it
Yes.
allows people a very, very even just gentle way in to exploring what that history is.
Yeah.
Like I wonder what that name means. I wonder where it comes from.
Right.
Are all really, really basic questions that spark when you
Right.
have something given a traditional name, like you're saying. But yeah, that's all of this. If this was episode, you take away anything from this episode you're listening, is go travel around the West a little bit. It's super,
Mhm.
super cool, and will lead to a bunch of experiences in terms of the interaction of the federal government in ways that you just don't experience in the East. There's just not enough
It's true.
present. There's not enough dynamic. Even national parks, there are
Mhm.
some, but they don't feel as like so much of the West is parks and the Bureau of Land Management,
Mhm.
versus
But
Becky's, which is very, very developed in a way. Go ahead, Lynn.
just before you go, make sure you read Dr. Nelson's book about
Yes.
Yellowstone, because
Yes,
you'll go into it
please.
with a different perspective that will make things mean more. I mean, yes, things are beautiful and it's wonderful to see, these gorgeous sites, but to understand the history of these places makes it all that much more meaningful. And I do have
Yeah.
to say, your writing is incredible. I mean, I felt like I was almost reading fiction, like not but it was, as someone who reads a lot of history monographs
Yeah.
that aren't necessarily written to be like a story that you feel like you're in. yours really is like that. I mean, you really feel like you're in the story.
Yeah, please
Oh,
take it as a
thank you.
compliment that you don't write like a historian.
I know.
Yeah. It's like, how do I say this? Yeah, nicely. But yeah.
Oh, no, I mean,
Yeah.
I do always say I was on a panel at the AHA on
Hmm.
writing for public audiences, and someone in the audience asked this really great question, which is, how do you define success
Hmm.
as a book author? And, we're all like, well, it's all well and good to talk about book sales, but who knows what the market is doing? No one has any
Hmm.
idea how anything is going to happen. And so I thought about it and I was like, I am happiest when I receive notes or like feedback, like from you, Lynn, where it's someone says, like, I felt like I learned a lot, but it was also a really good read. And
Right.
that's part of my goal because I am a huge fan of fiction. I love reading fiction. I wish I could write fiction. I mean, can you imagine not having to footnote? Amazing.
I know. It'd be
It'd be
scary, I
so
think.
good. We'd be so fast. Like we could kick out a book a year if
It'd
we
be
could didn't
so
have to
easy. Just make
footnote.
it up.
Just make it up. Um, but yeah, I mean, I really do love this kind of new phase of my career where I'm writing narrative history and kind of putting
Hmm.
people on the ground with historical actors, because I do think it's really important to understand. I mean, I think so often, we just look at these black and white photographs, we look at maps, everything seems in 2D in the past,
Yeah.
like
Yep.
not related to us, right? But
Hmm.
they were 3D people. They were
Yep.
living in the world. They were complicated. They had emotions. They, fell in love and out of love. They got angry. Like they did all of these things. Some of them were terrible people, and some were
Right.
really good. Like, and so I like being able to actually kind of make that argument by setting you down and immersing you kind of in a
Yes.
place and time, so you get to know these people. And the three people in Saving Yellowstone who were the major protagonists were just so fascinating to me. I mean,
Hmm.
Ferdinand Hayden himself is just,
Oh, yeah.
he's a piece of work. Like, I mean, he just, he's like, I want to make a lot of money, but my only talent is fossil hunting. So what am I going to do? And so, but
We've all been there.
haven't we
Yeah.
but he's got a lot of ambition. He's not scared. He was one of these guys who would just like write to people and be like, oh, hey, like, I need you to be my mentor. Like, let's go, and people either loved
Love
him
it.
or hated him. But it really served him well in the field. Like everybody, all of his team members really loved him and respected him because he was a really good manager of people. Like he basically
It's
like let
good.
them do what they wanted to do, but then was also like, we will reconvene in camp and you will give me your specimens and you will write out the the tag in the way that I have shown you. And then we will all drink whiskey. I mean, so it was, these are real living human beings in the past. And I think to understand the past, we have to acknowledge that. And I also feel really strongly, a lot of people say to me like, why do I want to read all of these horrible things about, you know, Yellowstone and about, Indian land dispossession and all of this stuff. I just want to go
Hmm.
and I just want to look at a pretty waterfall,
Hmm.
Mm,
and my argument to that is always, I know all of the worst things, right? I know all of the backstory. I know all of the horrible things that people did to each other in this place. And I still go to Yellowstone and I just stand there and I'm amazed. And so if I
Right.
can do that, like if I can go in and understand the context and have it
Hmm.
enrich my experience and still sort of gain a lot from the beauty of that place, then I think any visitor can.
Ah, I think that's beautifully
I think
said.
it's a great message to end the episode on. And we normally end with a question, but I think yours is self-explanatory about where people should go visit to explore your work. But I don't think we need to necessarily ask
Hmm.
that.
I think we
Go
can
Um,
guess
to all
that.
the national parks.
but as always, this conversation was brought to you, our listeners, from our supporters over on Patreon. So if you want to get early access to our episodes and some other tidbits, and sometimes we even give away some books that are signed by the authors that we interview. So go check out our
Ah, yes.
Patreon. And even if if you join for free, you can get access to our Discord server
Mhm.
where you can have direct access to both Lynn and I and some of the historians we've interviewed, and always some interesting historical conversation. And you can check that out at patreon.com/primary source media. But now that the plug is done, thank you so much, Dr. Nelson. That was a wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Oh, thank
Yes.
you so much for having me. I love talking about parks.
Yes, thank you
So
so
good.
much. We'll have the link to your book in the show notes so
Awesome.
everyone can just scan
And the
down. There you
course.
go.
Oh,
And your great
awesome. Thank
absolutely,
you.
your great
Yeah,
course.
so the
Yes.
Shenandoah is one of those episodes.
Oh,
Yes.
cool.
Yes. And so is Death Valley.
Oh,
Uh,
wow.
and
Okay.
so is Denali.
Oh,
Hawaii Volcanoes, which is
Ooh.
all about like science, the science of
Ooh.
volcanism.
oh,
Which
You're
is
that
covering
is
all the
fascinating.
good
All right.
stuff.
it's yeah,
I know.
there's lots of really interesting. Like I learned a lot like researching for that class. It was really, really fun.
Yeah, thank you for being here.